Hey, thanks, Matt. That's great, great, just great to be here. I mean, I think it's exciting to have people in the room that are as passionate about DevSecOps as all of us. So we're going to go through and share with you some of the things that we've been doing that fit into the DevSecOps standards. I think we all know that going through and trying to do a standard on your own is very, very challenging. So what's great about OMG and CISC is having the capabilities to come together with a group of people like this and that are looking for common themes, common causes, and ways that we can go ahead and help each other and collaborate together. So what do I have to put in slideshow mode or? Oh, okay. All right, perfect. Okay, so why don't we do introductions real quick? So
here we go.
Just hit this button. Okay. Sorry, I'm used to a Mac. This is all new for me, this PC stuff. So Chris Giannakopoulos here. So I am a member of CISC. So I'm on the governing board at CISC. I joined about a year ago. Really was trying to figure out, how to navigate OMG, and Bill Curtis was very, very helpful. And so went to a couple meetings, had a chance to meet Matt and team here and seeing what's going on with the DevSecOps. And I said, this is a perfect fit for me. Very passionate in DevSecOps. My company, Perforce, we're a DevOps company, and we're very focused on solving the problems throughout the DevOps tool chain. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is continuous compliance. So you'll hear a lot of continuous compliance themes in this conversation. And I also brought along our partner who works with us, our service delivery partner, who's also part of our organization and helps people understand navigating some of those challenges and some of those difficult frameworks. And that is Tim.
Hey, everybody. My name is Dr. Timothy Schulbach. I'm the president and CEO of Panacity LLC, the strategic partner with Perforce, of course. We actually got our start implementing in government systems specifically and specialize in DevOps and automation, as well as continuous compliance, right? So it was a great fit for us. We're also a regulator on the other side as well. So we are the regulatory body by which we go out and do inspections, FedRAMP, Cyber Maturity Model, ISO, IEC, and a bunch of other things that are ongoing out there. So we're a weird hybrid of sort of service delivery on one side, but yet also a lot of the big brain developing standards, sitting on boards and working together on trying to basically bring all this stuff together and help influence where we need to be going in the future for security. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, and I think you'll see throughout this process, you have to have people that are involved in the accreditation, the governance, people that have worked there and been there to help you with your standards. So really excited to have Tim along the journey here. You said I push this button here. Okay, perfect. It worked. I was pushing the off button. So Matt was so helpful to show the DevOps. We all have different names for it, right? The infinity loop, the tool chain. I look at it as the key is to it. It's continuous, right? We have to make sure that we all understand what part of the challenge of DevOps we're trying to solve for. DevSecOps is probably one of the terminologies you'll hear, but you also hear a lot about DevXOps. There's DevQualOps. And so what we wanted to do is kind of take some of those additional names to it, but really break it down into, okay, well, what part of the process should we focus in on? So as Matt said, it's a big challenge going out there and trying to do this all by yourself and, take off this huge challenge here. So what we're going to talk about to you today is we're focused on the IT operations portion of it. And, what that means to us is making sure that operations has that secure critical infrastructure so that your development team is not handcuffed or they don't have any barriers. We want to be able to give people the guardrails so that they can continue to get their job done in operations but also make sure that they're following those security guidelines and those frameworks that we'll get into. Some of the challenges that organizations are faced with are really the culture and making sure that people can come together and get their jobs done, but also make sure that they're not going out of compliance in that process. That's why continuous compliance and the continuous integration and the continuous quality and all of those different types of continuous improvements that they're looking for are going to be really key to making sure that you have a successful DevOps program. So Tim's a little bashful here, but he is very helpful in helping us understand, some of the challenges behind what are those security frameworks out there and how did we get there today? So Tim does CMMC accreditations for organizations, which is a very important framework if you're involved with the defense industrial base. I work across finance, I work across government. Those are two of my jurisdictions for Perforce, especially the Puppet brand, which is focused on infrastructure automation and making sure that you have continuous compliance across your entire infrastructure. But if you look at some of the things that our nation is focused on now and what are causing some of those challenges, we need to have critical infrastructure. Wherever we have any vulnerabilities, we have to make sure we can identify those and make sure that those are going through our infrastructure and caught very quickly. If you look at some of the challenges out there, is people do not know how to track and patch for vulnerabilities. And I think this is something that's going to lead to a lot of issues down the road. You want to make sure that your system has not only security, but resiliency. Nobody wants to be there or get that phone call. Why did that particular application go down that's running our entire e-commerce platform? Or something that could be related to healthcare or something that could be related to a application that is mission critical to the team there. So you want that security, you want that resilience, and you want to make sure that you can have all this information so that when somebody comes down from upstairs in your leadership committee, they have the ability to go through and easily perform an audit check and say, hey, green, you passed this test, or yellow, you need to go back and make sure that you're making changes to this, or red, meaning that we have to catch this because you're really accepted a lot of risk into our environment. And those different types of controls are out there in security frameworks. Everybody follows a different body of security framework, but a lot of them all come down to the same thing, right? It's your controls that you want to have in place so that something, if it were to go out of scope, you can quickly react and put it back into scope. Now that could be across your change management, such as if somebody goes in and makes an unapproved change, who did that change? How do you go back and make sure that that change is not going to impact something downstream? Do you have the capabilities now to be able to show who made that change? How long was that change out of compliance? And how quickly can I go back into compliance? We work a lot with government entities, so their frameworks are usually around DISA-STIG. Some utilize NIST and CMMC. Tim's going to talk to you a little bit about CMMC and why is that such an important framework right now. CIS benchmarks, Center for Internet Security, are also very important for tracking what are those controls in place. All of these play into each other. So if you have a PCI situation, you're probably running some sort of e-commerce. If you have a HIPAA situation, then you're probably running some sort of HIPAA controls. And these frameworks are not easy to calculate. They're not easy to keep in control because very easily you have to go ahead and make changes to these things. And you might be in compliance one day, but then the next day you're out of compliance. So, what can we do to make sure that that process is easy, it's automated, it's secure, and it really makes sure that if you're going to be focused on innovation and digital transformation, you don't want to be focused on your auditing and constantly having to go back and look at, what are the security controls out there. So you have to have that balance between your self-service so that your team can go ahead and get things done on your developer side and innovate, and also make sure you can have self-healing so that infrastructure is not going to come down and not have any issues where you could be shut down literally for days at a time. Tim, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you covered everything really well, but so you know, the problem with a lot of the frameworks out there is they're not a blueprint specifically with a detailed set of instructions, right? So some of the frameworks allow for a lot of creativity. So they say must have something out there, but what is that something, right? And so that's when we start talking about more tactical frameworks. So I try to, categorize things with a strategic side of the house. The strategy is building the governance program that is going to drive the requirements inside the organization, that is going to build policies and procedures that are the guardrails, if you will, of said organization, right? Now you got to be able to you translate that into something the IT guys and the DevOps people can actually put into some sort of implementation, right? So, we talk about DISA-STIG. DISA-STIG is a framework that is a very tactical level framework. And it's a very specific, here's each of these series of controls and here's exactly what they do. They're either on or they're off. There's no real third direction, right? So it's pretty simple, right? The binary solutions like that out there. There's also CIS, but then you go to the UK. So NCSC in the UK actually has different sets of standards. You go to the EU. The EU has another set of standards out there. You go into the Middle East, you go to Africa, you go Australia, right? There's a lot of different frameworks all over the world that could be implemented, really. So really what the conversation is about kind of segregating a bit, let the stakeholders identify the requirements of the organizations and draw managerial policies that's going to help drive the conversation around your tech stack. Well, at the same time, looking at what to adopt at that lower level, right? So that's where the middle management and everybody else who's closer to that technology issue that needs to problem solve it could adopt or recommend what they feel is best based on industry standards out there, right? So.
Great, thanks. So, what we want to talk about next is, what does this compliance look like? How do we go ahead and make sure that we can catch, these particular parts of the process, right? You got your IT operations on one side who's trying to make sure that everybody can continue with their tasks. They can make sure that they're not holding anything back. You got your security team on the other side who's saying, look, we're not going to take that risk. We're going to look at ways that we can go ahead and improve, but we're not going to run, with scissors, right? We want to make sure that we have some sort of meet in the middle type of secure infrastructure compliance resiliency. And so these are some of the things that you have to put into your policy, right? Because your policy is really what's going to drive your ability to have a secure critical infrastructure and be able to automate. So, what are those exceptions? Who has the ability to make those exceptions and those changes? What happens what happens after assessing if it's not proper in your environment? How do you go ahead and remediate that? How long does that take to occur? Because drift's going to occur. You're always going to have somebody that's making a change, and the last person in your infrastructure to make that change could be the one that wins the battle, but they might not be the one that's winning it in compliant perspective. And that opens up, where are we going with the audit story, right? You have to show, in God we trust, everybody bring data. You have to have audit evidence so you can really go ahead and prove that, hey, I'm allowed to make this change. I have the credentials to do this. I have, I'm making sure I'm doing this in the right environment. And every policy needs to have good benchmarks out there, right? So we need to know not only how we're doing, but how are our competition doing? How are other people doing it? Because collaboration among others is really what's going to get us to that policy as code that we need to focus in on and create a very strong framework with reduced risk. Tim, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so that really kind of got me thinking. Everything has been translated into some sort of iterative code process. So for non-developers, an iterative code process is essentially, I go in and tell it every single step it needs to take. If I don't tell it every single step it needs to take, or I don't give it the proper logic to infer new steps on its own, they do not get done, right? And so I can think of, just thinking back to the 1990s to the mid 2000s into the 2010s, there was a lot of iterative coding processes. So think batch scripts, various scripts that sysadmins or system engineers would be able to create and batch to make their lives easier, right? So deprecation of objects, rolling out of software, all these kind of things were more that iterative coding process. I feel in 2016 we went to a new direction, right? So declarative or desired state, right? So declarative is a lot easier, in my opinion, to teach a DevOps team, because as we start to mobilize DevOps, we start taking sysadmins who are used to bare metal hardware, putting things directly on it and touching that hardware and using a different suite of tools than we use today for doing that. The whole point was to bring our sysadmins, our DBAs, and our engineers all together in a single group and be able to say the developers need to be closer aligned with those people who are building the systems. As a developer, I shouldn't have to build my own web server. The DevOps people or sysadmin should be building the web server. I should just be building the code. But we're going to come together collaboratively and be able to build that, right? And be able to create these automation pipelines. So now we're going more towards that shift of declarative state. So now I don't have to think of everything. I just say, I want a Nginx server with this version on it, with these type of settings in my config files, poof, deploy, and then we can enforce that desired state through item potency, right? So item potency, for, again, non-people with the nomenclature out there, is basically it monitors the state of the thing that I set and it ensures that it doesn't move out of that state. And if it does, it corrects that drift, right? So those are the things that we're really talking about and how to roll things out more rapidly, right? And I think we're going to come up and talk a little bit more about things more in depth.
Yeah, exactly. And I just want to say, we also have to have our tasks, because we have to continue to do that process too, or else we're not going to get the work done, right? So, okay, so the secure critical infrastructure is aligned, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, with the CIS benchmarks, but you can see all these different frameworks go under this one framework. So a lot of people start with CIS benchmarks, and they might have many different operating systems out there that they're trying to manage to, whether it's Linux or Windows. Now there's many other operating systems out there, but how do they go ahead and make sure that their requirements align with what they're focused on? And so we break this down into two steps, right? I mean, everything is strategic nowadays. So we want to make sure that you take the strategic, but you're matching it with the tactical, because the tactical is going to make sure that you are constantly being able to be held accountable, as well as make sure that you have well documented what you're doing. This is an area that Tim is an expert in, because he has spent a lot of time not only helping people build out these infrastructure and making sure they're secured, but he also goes in and credits them. So that means he is the accreditor. He goes in, he certifies them, and he allows them to be able to say, I passed this. I know that I'm in a secure critical infrastructure situation. And, Tim has to sign his actually name to that. So, Tim, you want to talk to him a little bit about CMMC and some of the strategic and tactical?
Sure. So let's put our auditor hat on, right? So we're going to talk more about, segregating strategic away from the tactical. I think we kind of covered exactly what that is, right? The strategic is developing system security plans, policies and procedures, and then something fancy called plans of actions and milestones. That's a security person speak for saying project plan or tasks or backlog if you're a developer, right? At the end of the day, things to do, right, in our environment out there. And then, of course, all the requirements supporting documentation. So when we start talking about the accreditation frameworks, again, we're going to be having that discussion of what are we going to be doing as an accrediting body coming in to accredit your organization? What are we looking for? What are we doing? So the review of the things that we have up here on the screen under the strategic are the first step. We take a look at your accreditation boundary that you state that you have, because again, everything is stated by you in your system. You determine the boundaries. Those are the boundaries that I have that I'm constrained by as an auditor. I cannot audit or assess beyond the boundaries. And I have to assess the boundaries for completeness. And I have to assess the boundaries to ensure that people are doing their due diligence, right? So how do we do that? We read the documentation. We come in and have interviews, in-depth interviews with the stakeholders. Do they know what they're talking about? Do they even know what's written down there? Because a lot of times people will write policies for you, hand those to you, and you just sign your name on it, and then off you go. You don't actually read them. You don't disseminate them. You don't live, breathe, and eat, sleep and eat and breathe those things. As a stakeholder, it's very important that you are the person with the budget, the power of the purse, okay? You're the person that's going to give people the authority to carry out their duties and work, and then you're going to give them the ability to be a little bit of autonomous in that section and make their own shots. Don't bring everything to the top every single time. As long as you're working or navigating within the spirit of the accreditation or the policies and procedures that you've been constrained by, then you should be able to do that. And this is something that should be fluid. If somebody says, hey, I'm too constrained, I can't do this thing that you've asked me to do because this policy is not, broad enough for me to be able to get that latitude in there, we'll have that conversation, do a change control board, identify the changes you need, change those things, disseminate that information down, right? Lastly, the last thing that we need is we need evidence at the end of the day, tactical evidence. I have to scientifically measure something. This is much easier when we have the ISO conversation. If I'm investigating a meat packing plant, we're talking more about cooling temperatures, meat spoilage, handling procedures. Those things are very easy. Or a manufacturing facility. What is the manufacturing tolerance for this thing? How do you calibrate and understand what the calibration of your machinery is to ensure that you're punching out the proper parts for a Boeing aircraft or something like that, right? So those things are a bit easier versus the cybersecurity aspect of things. Now, how do I do those measurements? Well, I have to measure things by what you give me to measure those things by, and that's where we start talking about these tactical frameworks being applied in here. So under the cyber maturity model, CMMC is really driven by NIST 800-171, Rev 1, Rev 2, as well as 800-172 if you're at level 3. For the rating purposes out there. But again, those are broad strategic frameworks that doesn't give us the ability to lock the systems down or have that continuous compliance out there, right? This is where we have to adopt that type of technology. Moving on to the next one here.
Yeah, and like Tim mentioned, I mean, we'll both touch on this, but you know what your framework is, right? For this instance, we're going to choose CIS, but you can choose whatever framework you have. How do you harden those images now? I think a lot of people in their secure critical infrastructures, they don't harden their images properly, and now that creates more risk. So our standard is designed around showing, that you've been able to go ahead and prove that you've hardened these systems. Most people are out there manually hardening the systems, which could take a lot of time, or they could be using a golden image. We talked about Agile before. These are things that are more one-offs and you can handle and do in small environments, maybe up to like 100 servers or things like that. But once you start getting into thousands of servers and scaling and looking at like all these different baseline configurations that you have and looking at, how many configuration changes you're making, it gets very, very complicated very quickly. So, our framework agenda is to make sure that you can prove and easily harden all these images and all these different on these different applications. And if you look at what you want to add to that, real quick?
Let me add to that real quick.
Okay, I'll let Tim add to that.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is we're going to back up here just a minute and really talk about that system hardening, right? So here's the problem. There's a lot of items in the ecosystem that allow us to harden based on OS. Out there. So Red Hat, if you're all in with Red Hat, they've got a system that works great for all Red Hat things, but you probably have Macs, you probably have Windows, you probably have Linux and multiple flavors of Linux out there. So now you're going to have a variety of tooling to overlap, and now you've added complexity to your environment, right? So that's not something we want to do. Also, hands raised, who here has actually seen a CIS benchmark? Let's say the Windows 10 CIS benchmark. Anybody have an idea of how many pages the CIS benchmark is? For the latest CIS benchmark, just roughly? No, a lot more than 3, greater than 3. If this is the price is right, you're going towards that 0 number, I guess. You're trying to get the win. 1,200 pages for the CIS level 3 benchmark. Do you know how many controls exist in the levels of the CIS benchmark latest edition? 360. Okay.
What's CMMC 120?
Well, no.
Yes.
We're just talking CIS here. Disastig, it could be 540 roughly controls, depending on if you have all enhancements on there. Basically, if you want to turn it into a brick that doesn't talk anything, you implement all those things, right? So that's a problem. Also, what works for your organization, right? So if you go the golden image way, which is the old school way, everything ships to the IT department. IT will create a golden image that they then image the box, they ship it back out to the field, right? Servers are the same thing. They create an image, they flash it. Most things are virtual these days out there. But again, that's a point in time image. Now, what about the person in the accounting department, the shipping and receiving department, the logistics people, the IT personnel, DevSecOps, security? Do you think they all have the same level of need as far as application software suites and the amount of rights to do the job. So if we're going by the security frameworks, only the minimum amount of rights to get your job done, nothing more. DevOps people hate that because they don't have local admin rights to their box, so they can't add things and they can't build stuff, and they have a very difficult time with that, right? So now I painted your organization. You have multiple needs. You have a large field, and as soon as I ship this thing out, it's going to have drift. On top of that, when I come in to do the assessments and audits, I'm going to ask you, hey, you have a golden image. Awesome. Hey, you have a build guide. Awesome. Hey, show me your current system baseline, and then show me the last 6 months of drift for all your machines, and then show me where you've identified the drift, corrected the drift, and had 100% change and control and compliance in your environment. How many organizations do you think are actually going to be able to do that?
Not many.
Almost zero. I'm going to tell you right now, the failure rate is really high, because when I ask them for that, or when my assessors ask them for that, it's like the first time they're hearing that, right? They're like, well, what do you mean? How do I even do that, right? Like, do I go out and inspect every single machine on SneakerNet? Well, God, that's a technique, but there's software and modern ways to be able to do this. You could go to a repo and download a random repo that solves most of your problem. But when I start looking around, most of the repos were built 6 years ago, have been abandoned, not being maintenance and managed. So now you're taking on a technical burden with a lot of technical debt in your organization, to a person who's probably not even sleeping at night already, because that person is well overworked, just trying to fight a fire every single day to keep alive, right? So the big strategic overview environment is not their priority, right? So we got to be able to fix that out there, and we really start talking about that.
Yeah, so we're not going to touch on this slide too much, but I do want you guys to understand that control unclassified information is really what's driving the CMMC, and this QE is something that now needs to be accounted for with anybody that's working as a third-party supplier in the government. So they want to take away that third-party risk. And so this plays into the hardening of those systems, so that now you really can say, all right, I have my federal contract information. I know my controlled and classified information, what resides on what servers. I've gone through and I've been able to pass through and make those different hardening that Tim talked about. So how do we pull this all together? Well, it's through policy as code, right? I mean, we have so many different types of policies out there, but we have to codify it. And so, you have your policy exceptions that we talked about earlier. Those are the ones that are tracked and have to be clearly documented. You've got the configuration drift throughout your entire infrastructure now, because everybody's constantly making a change. It's dynamic. It's not going to, these aren't the days of waterfall where we're trying to go ahead and make a change like every 4 to 8 weeks. We're trying to make incremental iterative changes, sometimes, multiple times a day, if not an hour. What is that visibility that you have? What is that observability? Try to say that 10 times fast within the organization, that you can prove and say, hey, I know that these IT systems have been hardened. They're in compliance. I know, what changes have been made. And then you have to bring this all down to that framework, right? Well, you have your leadership that's saying, well, we need to consolidate tools because we have to reduce costs. We have to make sure that we can enforce compliance through our compliance modules that fit for that particular system that we're looking to harden. And we have to automate this because we're constantly making changes and we can't manually do this. I was talking to a large Midwestern bank the other day, and they take the first 6 months of every year, 2 full-time employees have to go through and set their baselines and make sure that their compliance are in place. And then after that 6 months, what happens? They're out of compliance. So you're constantly trying to make these changes and all these things going around. So, these are some of the benefits of how we're looking to bring policy as code into the environment. And we want to make sure that we're bringing this to the forefront so that people across security, IT operations, and developers are still looking at ways that they can enforce and help and make sure that they, are auditing this along the way. But at the same time, we don't want to take away from, what's already in place there. So, as a member of an organization that is very focused on helping people create policy as code and making sure that, whatever that particular system that you want to get information out of and details out of, how can you leverage that so that you can go ahead now and make sure that you're always not only in compliance, but you're tracking all that drift? Tim's done a great job as one of our partners, being able to go through and build out different infrastructures for people in the government, in finance, leveraging our puppet agent. And he's been working with this for over 10 years now. So he has a lot of experiences, and I think he can really give you some good insight as to why we think a standard is very important from a secure infrastructure standpoint, but also from a way that you can do this very easily if you have an agent-based way of tracking things. And there's other, obviously, pipelines out there, and there's other tools out there. But, you know, for us particularly, we're trying to look at a way that we can bring in desired state automation with task automation that also layers compliance on top of it, because it's not about, you know, configuration management anymore. It's about managing that drift. It's about making sure that you can assess, remediate, and can go ahead and enforce, so that we're all going to have secure critical infrastructure. Tim, you want to talk about what you've built and what you think the solution could look like?
So over the last 10 years, roughly, we've been working with a lot of governmental agencies, everybody from the DoD to the intelligence community to federal civilian systems, right? And, you know, thank you, Data Center Optimization Initiative. Anybody familiar with Decoy yet? That came in under the Obama administration. It gave us 10 years to move to optimize meaning cloud, right? It was a cloud-centric, cloud-first mentality. So the government basically forced all their agencies and entities to consolidate all their data centers and then all their data archives, and then move it as much off their systems to the cloud, one, for carbon credit reasons, two, for deduplication or reduction. We did the consolidation of the Department of Transportation when they moved from LaFont Plaza over to the Southeast Federal Campus. When we redesigned the network, I found 14 redundant systems in every mode of that federal agency that we now made one set of systems. That's a lot of government waste at the end of the day. That's, you know, borderline waste, fraud, and abuse, right? This is what happens when you build everything in a silo. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to come in with a very simple concept, right? We have management from anywhere out there. It could be through the internet, VPNs, you know, networks. VPNs are dead, right? Most people are not using VPNs anymore. We're now using SASE technologies and other management TLS-based connective ways of communicating things very securely. So all the things that we already talked about up until now, notionally, let's say we've already developed that policy as code, right? You spend your first couple of weeks or couple of months or even your first year working with the stakeholders and saying, let's codify all the things you need. What does your development platform look like? Let's talk to your developers. What is your regulatory burdens and requirements for NIST 853 and RMF if you're a federal agency, right? Let's now fuse those things together, adopt a central framework. Okay, you want to do DISA-STIG or you want to do CIS? Okay, we're going to choose that tactical framework for you. And then we're going to be able to pull out stuff into our ecosystem, develop that policy as code, and it's pretty simple. Look familiar for your ecosystem, right? Cloud VDI workstations, on-prem servers. This is pretty much a representation of everything that's in federal systems. Well, first thing we do is one-step deployment. We load the agent on those boxes, no matter where they sit, doesn't matter. They communicate and comply with our central web service. This could actually be a bucket on the internet through a content delivery network. It just needs to get the instruction. That's it. You know, if you think of it in the form of a recipe in a cookbook, it is literally just the recipe that it needs to get so it can cook everything on the other side for you. I want a chocolate cake. I don't have to tell it how many cups of flour or what type of chocolate I'm putting in it. It just makes me a chocolate cake at the end of the day, right? That's kind of the mentality there. All right. And then, of course, for sustainment, all those systems are audited for drift, right? So I have a set of instructions. If I want to maneuver off that, well, I could do two things. I could just track my drift and just be aware of what the drift looks like and do nothing to enforce it, or I can enforce item potency and ensure that things, you change it changes back. You change it changes back. You're fighting the system, okay? And I want that frustration out there for people, so they have to go back to the governance process. Technology review boards, change control boards, make everybody aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it. It also eradicates bad behavior in systems. I can't tell you how many times I've witnessed IT people just do whatever the heck they want just because they got to get something done. They rather ask for forgiveness versus for permission, because the permission red tape is so long and hard to get through, right? Well, if we do it as policy as code, then we could just go literally put it in the code, commit, get notified. Here's the change. Some stakeholder reviews it. Somebody talks about it. It's now instantaneous. It doesn't have to be a long drawn out process. It could literally be minutes long. Every time I want to introduce a change, we can introduce a change. Somebody can review it. You have 2 or 3 people identify, they codify, it's documented. Your code and your change of state of the code really becomes your entire change control process at the end of the day, right? That's really what we want in this organization where we want to drive these standards. We want to be able to take all this stuff, put it in some sort of server by which to deliver a report to people. One thing that we did is we took the APIs of Puppet and Comply and all the other various items in the ecosystem. They have a full API-rich architecture. We just basically sucked all the goodies out of that, presented it to the customer in a way that's better for them. They didn't want to go into the Puppet console. They didn't want to go, I didn't want to give them access to the system that's going to make the change, right, out there. So this is the way that we wanted to deliver the report to the stakeholders. We give them their report. It goes directly to the stakeholders. Everybody's made aware. So anytime a change occurs in the system, anytime drift occurs in the system, report goes out, the proper people are notified, we go out and fix the issue. Look at that. I just delivered a whole solution on how to keep your entire environment, whether it's 1 server or 1 million servers, all compliant, all within configuration. So I'll wrap it up for us, Chris. There.
Yeah. And, so our plan is we want to go to some of our partners, gather metrics from them, what's interesting to them, their measurements, and they're all using, a lot of people have different programs in place. So we want to find out, why they built their program that way, hoping that people in this room, as well as, people that aren't in this room, could just really help us. We think that it's very important for everybody to come together because this is a major problem that is obviously not a government problem. It's not a, competition problem. It's our problem because if we don't have the proper, oh, sorry. Oh, if we don't solve this problem together, it's only going to get bigger and bigger. So I think it'll be a perfect fit into what we're doing with the DevSecOps initiatives. I think we need to come up with vocabulary. We need to really just think about okay, what does good look like and how do we continually to improve that along the way? So thank you so much for allowing us to present today. And I hope this was helpful.